an equal opportunity mob boss. But his creation of a murder-for-hire ring made him one of the deadliest.
In the early 1930s, New York was a mob killing field. Out of this bloody chaos, there emerged one cold-hearted, brilliant gangster named Lucky Luciano.
I never looked in his eyes, because it was strange, it was haunting, weird.
Lucky connived and killed his way to the top. When he got there, he laid the foundation of modern organized crime, and the money poured in.
He loved being Charlie Lucky Luciano, the #1 gangster in town.
Luciano thrived on his reputation as the biggest racketeer and the most eligible bachelor in Manhattan.
Every time he would walk into a room, I'd get like butterflies in my stomach. It was like a sexual attraction.
But Lucky paid the price for his notoriety when a crusading gangbuster named Thomas E. Dewey sent him off to prison. Behind bars, Lucky not only kept his position as chairman of the mob, but came to the aid of his beloved United States during World War II, greasing the way for U.S. troops invading his native Sicily. After the war, the gangster who loved America was forced to leave it behind. But Lucky would then prove that the mob, like other big businesses, was not troubled by national borders. Lucky could run a racket anywhere, and did. The man who would one day make the mob run like a big business was born in the poor Sicilian town of Lercara Friuli on November 24th, 1897, and given the name Salvatore Lucania. It was a town where most of the men, including his father, worked long days in the sulfur mine at the top of the hill. A hard life from which the family longed to escape. Hearing that across the ocean, America had streets paved with gold, they sailed to the promised land in 1907. The family found a flat in a Jewish neighborhood on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, just a few blocks from relatives in Little Italy. Only the streets were not as promised. Housing was cramped and dirty. Crime was rampant. Young Salvatore, one of 4 children, enrolled at PS 40, but he rarely showed up at school. Soon, he was dumped into the Brooklyn Truant School. By age 14, he was a dropout. His first job, delivery boy for a hat maker, earned him $7 a week. Chump change to many of the young hoods that Charlie encountered on the streets. Their racket, shaking down immigrants who sold food and clothing from pushcarts. Salvatore also saw kids his own age, gambling, fencing stolen goods, and dealing drugs. The streets were soon his classroom of crime. He was an eager and clever student.
There was always a suspicion that he used that job of delivering hats when he first started fooling around with the sale of illegal drugs, and that he would put some in the hat boxes as a good hiding place and stroll along. There'd be nothing in his pockets incriminating. When he wanted to make a delivery, just reach into the hat box, make the sale, and continue on his way.
He heard the lure of the street at a very early age, at least by the age of 14. He by then had committed to a criminal life. He was out there doing small-time crimes, smoking opium, having a sex life of sorts.
New York City police caught up with him for the first time at the age of 18. The charge? Possession of heroin. By then he was using various names, including Charles Lucky Luciano. But for the moment, his luck had run out. He got a year in prison. Luciano's hard-working parents, embarrassed by their drug-dealing son, never visited him in prison. After 6 months behind bars, Charlie was released, having used the time to further his criminal education. Besides peddling dope, he now gambled, earned much more money, carried a gun, and joined his first Italian gang, the Five Pointers. The gang was well-connected. Every election day, its job was to harass voters, sometimes at gunpoint, into supporting New York's corrupt Democratic machine known as Tammany Hall. For this, the gang was well compensated.
That would enable them to engage in their other criminal activities during the year with a very understanding Tammany Hall, who appointed the police captain in each precinct, who appointed the magistrate that you would be brought before if you should be arrested. So you got protection for all of your illegal activities during the course of the year if you worked for Tammany Hall on Election Day.
But Tammany Hall couldn't always protect the gang. In 1923, federal narcotics agents arrested Luciano for dealing heroin. Charlie decided to save himself by ratting on some Jewish gangsters who had a trunk full of heroin in a basement on the Lower East Side. It was nothing personal against Jewish crooks. In fact, Charlie, who had grown up in a Jewish neighborhood, was unique in his early willingness to work with gangsters of any background.
And if they could get along together and make money together, that was the only standard that Luciano had. He didn't care what your nationality was or what your religion was. If I can trust you and we can make money, we'll work together.
Two of the Jewish gangsters he befriended were the good-looking, violent Benjamin Bugsy Siegel and the short, quiet, intellectual Meyer Lansky, who had become Luciano's most loyal partner in crime for the next half a century.
And they got together on the Lower East Side, sometime in their late teens, apparently, and became very close friends. A relationship that was so close that Bugsy Siegel, for example, who knew them both well, said that they were more than brothers, they were almost like lovers. Not to suggest that they had sex, but they had that kind of unspoken, intuitive bond. They could finish each other's sentences, or there would be a pause, and then the other one would say what the other was thinking. It was a very close connection, and it's a key to Luciano's rise, because he always has Lansky whispering in his ear.
Another key to the rise of Charles Luciano? Being in the right place, New York, at the right time, the 1920s, the era of prohibition and bootlegging. Charlie and his friends were lucky enough to learn the racket at the feet of a master, Arnold Rothstein, the man reputed to have fixed the 1919 World Series.
Arnold Rothstein hired Lansky and Luciano, Ben Siegel, Frank Costello, a lot of other people who became famous names in organized crime later on, all went to work originally for Rothstein. He became a financial backer for some of these young men. Okay, you learn the business, now you go out on your own, and I will give you the financial backing and some political protection.
Just like Al Capone out in Chicago, Charlie Luciano would earn his first million as a bootlegger. But unlike Capone, who was happy to consolidate organized crime in one city, Luciano would have a grander and darker vision. A board of directors overseeing rackets around the country, with himself as chairman of the board. Mob warfare has been known to create new crime bosses. Through cunning and violence, ambitious gangsters mold the chaos of war into a peace which they alone control. The rise to power of Lucky Luciano was the classic example. By the late 1920s, young Luciano was entering his 30s and already a big player in the New York mob. He was one of a few Italians who had valuable connections to Jewish gangsters such as Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. It wasn't long before one of the reigning Sicilian dons, Joe the Boss Masseria, embraced Luciano and made him his right-hand man. Lucky had the perfect qualifications for the job: power, connections, and most importantly, Sicilian ancestry.
He was of Sicilian birth, Sicilian on both sides of his family, and you needed that in those days to make it anywhere in the Mafia. But at the same time, he was more Americanized. He also had much wider contacts than most of the Sicilian gangsters, so he was able to use both these things to rise as a gangster.
He also used the bloody turf war that was raging between Joe the Boss Masseria and another old-time Sicilian don, Salvatore Maranzano. First, Maranzano tried to persuade Lucky to switch sides and work for him. When Luciano refused, he paid a stiff price.
He was picked up by 4 gangsters, apparently, around 50th Street in New York City. They beat him up terribly. He was bloodied and stabbed and kicked around and left for dead.
Luciano's survival was a stroke of luck, reaffirming the nickname he'd used for years. The attack by Maranzano's men left him with a droopy eyelid and a nasty scar across the chin, which did nothing to improve his already harsh features.
He was pockmarked anyway from smallpox when he was a child. So you looked at him for the first time and it was a nightmare of a face, I can tell you.
The attack left another deep and lasting impression on Luciano, that the gang war between the two aging Sicilians was pointless and bad for business. And it was his mission to resolve it on his terms. Step 1.
He took his boss to lunch at a very nice Italian restaurant in Coney Island.
At a certain point, Luciano excuses himself and goes to the men's room, and just at that point, remarkably enough, in come the assassins and kill Joe the Boss. So Luciano has shifted his allegiance to Joe the Boss's great rival, Salvatore Maranzano.
Predictably, Maranzano embraced Lucky and made him his right-hand man. But Luciano had no patience for his new boss with his old-world traditions.
The old school of Sicilian mafia bosses was very formal and had strict codes of behavior and strict forms of even social forms of address and initiation into the mafia. Luciano wasn't interested in any of that stuff. Bucks is what we're after.
So step 2, kill the new boss. Lucky hired his Jewish friends, including Bugsy Siegel, to be the hitmen. They cornered Maranzano in his office near Grand Central Station.
They opened fire on him and they stabbed him with knives. They just made mincemeat out of him, just blew him away.
Having killed the 2 leading dons in New York, Luciano was now unquestionably the most dominant single gangster in the biggest mob city in America. So Lucky set about Americanizing the Mafia. He gathered around him the heads of the major crime families in New York City, Chicago, and Buffalo, and made them into a board of directors. He called it the Commission. To avoid turf battles and maximize profits, they divvied up the rackets. With the end of Prohibition in 1933, the big rackets were gambling, prostitution, narcotics, and extortion. They also created their own group of contract killers, known in the press as Murder Incorporated. The chairman of this commission was Luciano himself. Lucky's organizing paid off. Gangsters started killing each other far less often and making much more money.
Organized crime families were pulling in as much money as the 10 largest industrial corporations in the United States put together.
Luciano's success as chairman of the mob was due to a basic leadership skill. He knew how to listen and get others to listen to him.
When Lucky told a story, when Lucky said anything at all, everybody listened. Yeah, yeah, Lucky, yeah. Lucky laughed, everybody laughed. It was just wonderful to watch this. But when he got mad, it's like a knife right at you.
Off the job, Lucky, the confirmed bachelor, enjoyed life as any social climbing multimillionaire would in the midst of the Great Depression.
He lived a very glamorous life, the best nightclubs, the Stork Club, the 21 restaurant, the races. He got around to all the right places, always with a big wad of cash.
He prided himself on the elegance of his clothes. He always had a great, huge white handkerchief just exploding out of his pocket.
In the early 1930s, former President Herbert Hoover kept a New York apartment in the Waldorf Towers. General Douglas MacArthur had an apartment in the Waldorf Towers. And Lucky Luciano moved into the Waldorf Towers. That impressed a great many people.
Especially women. Lots of them. What Luciano lacked in the looks department, he made up for in charm and the eternal twin aphrodisiacs, money and power.
I used to get a funny feeling whenever Lucky would walk in a room, and when I was real young, I never could understand that. I didn't realize that's how dopey I was. I didn't realize that it was like a sexual attraction.
He has parties, there are lots of women around, but never any serious relationship. I think it says something about his ultimate selfishness and self-involvement. What he was interested in was his career as the biggest gangster in town, and he didn't want any distractions. He wanted women for momentary amusement, but for nothing more than that.
Luciano was a regular on the Manhattan social scene. The upper crust didn't mind that during business hours, Lucky was a cold-blooded killer, extorting millions.
A lot of white Anglo-Saxon